Hi everyone, and welcome to the last of our lectures. Okay, this one's going to focus now on sampling a variety of different infections that are either caused by vectors, being soil-borne, being water or food transmitted. Now, I also want to apologize if you hear any background noise. They are doing construction near my house on the side street, so if you hear that, kind of just tune that out. The first category that we're going to look into are infections that are vector-borne. Now, just like with the previous lecture, I want to point out that today these are all just a small sampling of examples from each of these categories, but there are a whole lot more infections that you face in everyday life. Now, when you hear vector-borne, I want you to think vectors being things like arthropods, which you're going to see on the next slide. Okay, arthropods, insects, causing you to end up getting sick. So things like mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, flies. You then have a little bit more mentioning encephalitis, and some of the big causes of encephalitis are actually arboviruses, meaning arthropod-borne. So especially from mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are the big one, causing things like Zika, West Nile virus, and any of these can end up hitting the nervous system. And a lot of times any of the infections that target the nervous system are going to cause paralytic issues and can be very damaging. And in the case of encephalitis, the big thing that they do to try and help cut this down is vector control, which we mentioned in an earlier lecture. Things like all those sprayings of parks and residential areas. The first one is one of my favorites. So this is the plague. Okay, when it comes to the plague, I want you to remember Yersinia pestis causes the plague. So anytime you see the word Yersinia pestis, that's responsible for the plague. And I want you to associate the plague with the plague doctor, which is seen over here. So I'm kind of jealous that doctors no longer get to wear these outfits because they're pretty cool looking. So the reason the plague doctor looks like that is if you think about the bubonic plague and the horrible conditions at the time where this infection was so problematic, there were tons of people getting sick. There was the just smell of disease, of infection, of dead bodies, of just all kinds of problems here. And so what these doctors would do, that beak mask that he's wearing, that's filled with herbs and other things with smell to ward off smells, and because they thought that it was a filter for pathogens. So it's kind of like, you know, the masks that doctors wear today. They were trying to protect their own nose and mouth from getting infected. But like I said, it also was filled with herbs for the smell of all of the disease and infection that was caused by this problem. Now, with plague, you'll notice that there are three examples there. There's bubonic plague, there's septicemic plague, there's pneumonic plague. So it basically depends, is the bacterial growth in blood and lymph? Is there septic shock? So is your patient going into organ failure? A pneumonic one is focused in the lungs, and it is highly contagious, as are the other ones as well. But pneumonic plague is very, very airborne contagious with nearly 100% mortality. Okay, but now when you see that it's caused by bacteria, the good thing is antibiotics were then able to be used for this kind of infection. Another cardiovascular issue is tularemia. With tularemia, you'll notice that it's a zoonotic disease. So whenever you hear zoonotic, this is coming from animals. As you can see on this slide, especially from this little picture here, okay, this is one of the ones that is carried on things like rabbits, but it's mainly being transmitted because of things like ticks. So please always be very careful about ticks when you're out in any kind of wooded area or any even grassy, very grassy areas. And as you can see in the pictures, there'll be these big bulbos forming. So bulbo is that very big protrusion on the throat that you're seeing on the skin, and you'll get ulcerations as well. But this is going to be not seen as much in the hospitals where you have now. But the good thing about tularemia is very low mortality rate. Then we have Lyme disease, and I want you to be extra aware of this one because of the fact that this is transmitted by deer ticks, and that you have seen throughout the past couple of years a major increase in the number of deer around this region. So around the Jersey region, around the New York region, you see them on campus all the time. And it's funny because so often people just think of, dangers when they see the organism right in front of them. So for instance, if you see the deer right there at that moment, you're like, oh, I probably should avoid that spot. But you don't realize that those deer are walking all over campus, all over the grass, all over the walkways when you're not there. So there are plenty of times, at night you leave for the night, and now they're roaming all over the grass. And what happens when they're walking along these tall blades of grass and plants? The deer ticks, the ticks on them, get brushed off onto the grass. And then what happens when you walk through that grass, or you sit on the grass, or you are putting your bags or anything near that grass or that sidewalk? Well, now you get that little tick on your property, on your skin, okay, crawling on you, and that's how you can get bitten. So please be very careful with this. Lyme disease is the most common tick-borne disease that you encounter. It's caused by the bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi, okay? And you'll notice in this picture right here in the corner that Borrelia burgdorferi, when you look at their shape, they're spiral shaped, okay? So spiral shaped, one of the few spiral shaped ones that we've encountered so far. Now, when we talk about Lyme disease, I want you to circle, star, highlight that bullseye rash, okay? That's the big first phase. You see the bullseye rash where you've been bitten, and you might get flu-like symptoms. The reason why I want you to circle this, first off, is I want you to always associate bullseye rash with Lyme disease. But also, I want you to associate this and circle this because of the fact that you notice its first phase. If you catch Lyme disease, and I don't mean if you catch it as in the infectious way, but I mean if you spot and detect Lyme disease in the first phase, you can easily treat it before you get problems, okay? Antibiotics will take care of it without as much issue to you. If it gets to the second phase and then the third phase, you are going to start having major problems. First of all, because it ends up going neurological at later phases. So the third phase, you'll start to have neurological issues, even mental dysfunctions, and it will then start to present autoimmune symptoms. Okay, so a lot of people will mistakenly think that Lyme disease is autoimmune just because of the fact that they're seeing problems in the immune response. Basically, what happens is it inhibits your lymphocyte and cytokine production. So you're not going to have proper immune function. Now, like I said, make sure to remember the bullseye rash, because the later the stage, the more difficult it is to treat with antibiotics, and the more problems it's going to cause in your life, because anything that starts hitting neurological or immune system issues becomes very taxing on your everyday life. The last one that I want to mention here is relapsing fever. This is another one of the Borrelia species. This is a spirochete. Okay, so spirochetes, you usually think of syphilis, but relapsing fever is also caused by a spirochete. And again, you're seeing transmission by ticks. So please always be careful. You know, in some of these slides, you notice ticks from rabbits, you notice ticks from deer, in this case, ticks from rodents. Okay, so always be very careful thinking about when you walk on the grass, if you ever try and sit on the grass or when you're outdoors, remember that you're not the only thing that was there, that there are a lot of animals that roam around, whether you're seeing them at that moment or not. And a lot of them can accidentally, you know, drop these little arthropods into the grass or into the walkways or even on seats where you're trying to sit. Okay, so please always be careful when you're outdoors, and if you're ever going into the woods or a very heavily brush area, make sure to check yourself. Check your clothing, check under your hair, have someone else check your back, your legs, check all over to try and make sure that you don't see any kind of bites on you, and keep an eye on things, because even though there are treatments with antibiotics, you don't want to deal with some of these problems. And things like Lyme disease can cause you problems for quite a long time, and relapsing fever as well. Okay, you get relapses, and even though they may not be as severe, it means, you know, this is something you're stuck with, where it's going to keep coming back, keep causing issues for you. So please always be careful. Then the last thing that I want you to remember with regard to eye infections is trachoma, which is the leading cause of blindness worldwide. And it is, like we just mentioned in the last slide, one of the big culprits of it is chlamydia. And in this case, rather than being transmitted through sexual contact or swimming pools, it's actually usually transmitted via hand contact or little flies. And the big problem with this is, kind of like we mentioned with other infections, you can get that kind of matting around the eyes. You could get kind of biofilm formation, and also the scratching that you do can cause scars, basically. And that produces, as you're seeing in the pictures, big problems in terms of scratching the cornea and damaging vision. The good news is that there is treatment, specifically oral antibiotics tend to help with this one. But especially since you tend to see this in a lot of third world countries, sometimes they don't get that treatment in time, and that's part of why it's such a big cause of blindness. So the first one to mention here is rabies. And for rabies, I want you to remind yourself that this is a zoonotic infection. And so you would write that as Z-O-O-N-O-T-I-C, zoonotic, because it's caused by animal bites. Funny enough, most people associate it with picturing a rabid dog, a dog foaming at the mouth and biting you. But dog bites actually aren't the most common cause. It's silver-haired bats, most interestingly. And actually anyone who does research or works in, zoo or outdoor kind of positions, they have to get the rabies shot because bats are so commonly rabid. Now, when we talk about rabies, another interesting point, like I mentioned in the last slide, there's no cure. And so kind of like with tetanus, people assume that the rabies shot that you would get after you get bitten by a questionable animal, they would assume that that's a cure. It's not. It's actually a vaccine. And again, this has to be done as soon as you get that exposure, while the possible infection is still in incubation, before it's actually taken hold. Now, what's interesting with rabies is there's another common misconception. People always only associate rabies with that rabid dog, the really aggressive, crazy, vicious animal. But that's only one type of rabies. That's what we call furious or classical rabies. And that happens because of the fact that this is neurological. So it ends up going to the nervous system and the brain, and it can dramatically alter, personality and make them highly excitable. But there's actually the opposite can also happen with this kind of brain damage and neurological impact. And that's the paralytic version. Okay, so that's the one where the animals end up being more like undergrad students, and they sit there looking very unaware of their surroundings, just ultra chill, minimally excitable. That's the paralytic rabies. So don't always assume that the animal has to be highly excited, aggressive, very, energetic. It can also be when they're uncharacteristically sluggish and look confused. Now we're going to go into some soil-borne examples. This time we are going to be focusing on bacteria, whereas previously we focused on helminths as being a lot of the soil-borne examples of infections. Now I want you to notice the disease names that I put in this red highlighted square here, rectangle. With these, I want you to basically just be able to recognize that each of these, anthrax, tetanus, gangrene, leptospirosis, and listeriosis, are all examples of soil-borne infections, okay? Infections that you can get from soil. Okay, basically a lot of times whether they were dropped there from animals or whatnot, it doesn't matter, just the fact that you can get them through contaminated soil. So just know these terms. We're not going to go into the details of all of them, but I do want you to be able to recognize when you see or hear those terms, be able to say, hey, those are soil-borne. And do that for each of the different infections that we talk about today. So for instance, when you hear West Nile virus from the previous slide, you should say, hey, that one's vector-borne, okay? When you hear anthrax or tetanus, hey, those are soil-borne. And the two that we're going to focus on, one of them actually is not in the rectangle. It's Pseudomonas, which is another soil-borne disease, and tetanus. Those are the two that we're going to go into a little more detail with, tetanus and Pseudomonas. Now, to mention a few examples, you've actually heard some of these throughout this course already. First up, for the nervous system, we have tetanus. And some information about tetanus that I kind of want you to focus on. First of all, tetanus releases exotoxins. And as you know, exotoxins are very, very problematic and very lethal. So in the case of tetanus, they're neurotoxin exotoxins. They specifically degrade proteins required for the normal physiology in the nervous system. So it causes paralysis, and you may think, well, paralysis, that's not that bad, sure, I can't move, but that's not going to kill me, right? Well, it does kill you, because paralysis doesn't just mean your body becomes paralyzed. It also means ultimately your respiratory system and your circulatory or cardiovascular system end up paralyzed as well. So death occurs when the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system shut down from paralysis. Now, when you think of tetanus, I want to remind you that even though most people think of it as the rusty nail causing it, that's not actually what's causing it. It's contracted from spores in the soil. And those spores then have parenteral root entry if, let's say, you get stabbed with that rusty nail or you step on that rusty nail. The other thing I want to point out is that there is vaccination to help prevent this. And so that's the DTaP vaccine, which also prevents diphtheria and pertussis. And so it's funny that a lot of people, when they hear tetanus, they're like, oh, it's okay, you can cure that with the tetanus shot. The tetanus shot is not a cure. It's preventative. It's actually a vaccine, and that's why you have to get it immediately. If you decided like, oh, I stepped on this rusty nail a few weeks ago, a few months ago, I'm going to get it now, that's a problem because it's not a cure. It's preventative. And so you need to get the shot before the infection actually takes hold, while it's still in that low incubation phase. Now, the other example I want you to remember of a soil-borne infection is Pseudomonas. So any of the infections that Pseudomonas cause. And Pseudomonas has a, close place in my heart because of the first way that I encountered Pseudomonas, which was many years ago before I started teaching microbiology. I covered a class for one of my friends who was teaching microbiology lab. And it was the day that you basically have students swab all of the different types of bacteria onto plates and then test different disinfectants and antibiotics with it. Now, with that class, one of the students who came up to the front desk where I was to get the samples accidentally spilled one of the samples, and the sample that was spilled was Pseudomonas. Now, the reason I remember that is because, we joked around that, okay, well, we won't know how bad of a problem this is until next week when we see the results. And guess what? As it says on this slide, Pseudomonas is very robust and highly resistant. Okay, it highly resists various different treatments that you try, different disinfectants and antibiotics. So always be careful of Pseudomonas because it is quite robust and quite resistant, especially since it basically has minimal nutritional requirements. So it can tolerate a very wide range of temperatures, and it can survive a lot of the environmental things that you throw at it. And sometimes you will find it not just in soil, but also in water. So in hospital environments, especially, you end up finding Pseudomonas in moist reservoirs like food, cut flowers especially. So when people used to get a lot of vases with, flowers, get well, bouquets and all, Pseudomonas ended up being a big problem in hospitals. That's why now a lot of the hospitals and even nursing homes or any kind of healthcare facilities do tend to restrict having flowers in a patient's room because they can bring various infections such as Pseudomonas infections. And in the next slide, we're going to go through a couple of examples also of how you might pick up Pseudomonas infections. But the flowers in the hospital, that's one of the kind of visuals that I want you to keep in mind. Think of Pseudomonas with that. Now, to show you what kinds of infections you can get in terms of Pseudomonas, okay, you see various different ones. Pseudomonas can colonize a burned wound. It can cause tissue necrosis, meaning, this gory grossness that you see here, basically tissue death and breakdown. You can also end up with bacteremia, which is basically sepsis from Pseudomonas infections. So it's actually, the reason why I emphasize flowers in the hospital is because Pseudomonas is actually one of the big causes of sepsis within hospitals. Now, there are various different bacteria and even some viruses that cause sepsis in hospitals, but I want you to be very aware of sepsis when it comes to studying microbiology and when it comes to your everyday life, because more than 250,000 Americans a year die from sepsis, and one year my dad was actually one of them. So I do always try to impart on students to please be careful when you are in hospitals or medical facilities, whether you're working in one or you're a patient or with a loved one in the hospital. Now, another example here that I want to show you is green nail, and I put that in red so that you'll circle, star, highlight. Whenever you hear green nail, think the cause is Pseudomonas. Pseudomonas, a lot of times you're going to see in the next slide, has this growth of a bluish-green tint on it. Now, the green nail that you see here, that's usually caused by going to nail salons, okay? People who put their hands or expose their hands or even their feet or legs to water that's been contaminated with Pseudomonas can end up with this infection. You can also end up with it on other parts of your skin, arms and legs like you see in the pictures as well. So basically think of that if you're going for any kind of manicures, even pedicures, putting your feet into these kinds of, water containers. You think sometimes when you see water like, oh, that's going to make things cleaner and better. Nope, not if the place is not very sanitary. Not if you think about it, you're not the only customer going there. So there's a lot of cross-contamination. And it doesn't just happen at nail salons, but even pools and hot tubs, you can get Pseudomonas, and sometimes it'll cause green nail. Other times it could cause things like UTIs, swimmer's ears, or any kind of eye infections. And for eye infections, think of the term conjunctivitis. That's how we usually hear them. But like I said, the big problem with Pseudomonas is it does have the ability to get into your bloodstream, and it's very resistant, which means it can cause big time problems with sepsis. So I want you to picture certain things like green nail, like hospital flowers, pools, hot tubs. When you think of these things, think of Pseudomonas. And the last thing I want to show you for Pseudomonas is, like I already mentioned with green nail, is that when we culture them in laboratory settings, sometimes you get to see this greenish blue tint in terms of Pseudomonas growth. And that's basically this green pigment caused by the production of two different pigments, blue and a yellow-green pigment. They're called pyocyanine and pyoverdinine, but you don't have to know that. Just know that when you see green-blue tint colonies, we usually associate that with Pseudomonas. Remember where you might get Pseudomonas and what it might cause.